Well, hey, I really appreciate you giving up your lunch hour to give me the chance to address this question of whether God and science are compatible. I'm going to argue that they are, which won't surprise you. You know that I've been invited by the Christian Union. But I would once have argued that they weren't. So when I was going up to university in Cambridge to study natural sciences, I was an atheist of the Richard Dawkins persuasion, and I held Christianity in some contempt. And I even wrote a poem to express what I thought about Christians. Now, it's not a very good poem because I was studying science rather than English, so bear with me, but I can still remember it, and it went like this. Some folk seem to find it odd that people grow from tiny cells. Pathetic, those who think of God and still drop coins in wishing wells. Okay, there we are. That was my contribution to English literature as an 18-year-old. But you can see something of my kind of idea about Christianity. It must be that people were just kind of naive about the scientific. They just didn't understand about cell biology. They must just be superstitious, like people who throw money into a well and make a wish and honestly expect it will change the future. I mean, sure, people used to believe that God made it rain with a giant watering can in the sky, but then we came to understand about evaporation and condensation and the water cycle. People used to think that illness was because of demons, and people got better because of miraculous healing. And then we came to understand about viruses and antibodies and T cells and so on. So surely now, you know, all these hundreds of years later after the scientific enterprise, surely it's now outdated, it's naive, it's ignorant to believe in the God of the Bible. That's what I used to think. I used to find that persuasive, but I don't any longer. About 2 months after writing my poem, I became a Christian, and my life changed very dramatically. I won't have time to tell you really how it happened, apart from to say I met Christians at university who weren't the gullible hypocrites that I assumed that Christians were. Intelligent people, people with integrity, and they just made me think a little bit more about Jesus' claims. And to cut a long story short, I became a Christian. But still a scientist, or I still finished my science degree, and as we've heard, I went on to do a PhD in auditory neuroscience, which sounds glamorous until you realise that basically I sat in a soundproof room for 3 years listening to about 20,000 clicks. I thought that was bad. One of my friends' brothers was doing a PhD in chemical engineering, sponsored by Hovis, the bread company, spent the entire Christmas holidays looking at electron micrographs of slices of bread and counting the bubbles. I'm not even joking. So, you know, PhDs, that's what it's actually like on the ground. But now it's one of those things that the modern atheists say that you can't be. I became a both and, a Christian and a scientist. And people like Dawkins are always telling us it's got to be either or. You know, either you're going to be a serious intellectual, or you can be a Christian if you're into that kind of gullible fairy stories type thing, but you certainly can't be both. Well, I, in my modest little way, am now both. But actually, I'm in good company, because it turns out that many of the greatest names in the history of science were also both ands. So maybe you know what some of these are famous for. We can do try a bit of audience participation. Do you mind if you're just waiting? Do you mind going right around the back, and then we've got room for people to kind of come in down the side as they arrive? That would be great. So some of these household names of science, people know what they did. Start with an easy one. Michael Faraday. This is audience participation. Michael Faraday discovered electricity. I think you know that, but you're just shy. Isaac Newton, even easier. Gravity, amongst other things, yeah. Johannes Kepler did work on interplanetary motions. Louis Pasteur discovered pasteurization. His theory was that there were invisible microbes, small microorganisms, bacteria, and so on. People like Charles Babbage, who built the first mechanical computer. So the leading scientists of their day, all of them committed believers in God. In fact, arguably, it was because they believed in God that they started to do science. According to one eminent historian of science, human beings became scientific because they looked for law in nature, but they looked for law in nature because they believed in a divine lawgiver. It was because they believed in a God who'd ordered the world in an intelligible way that they tried to understand the world in their laboratory. If people had believed in the 16th century, as some believe today, that the world's entirely random, it's questionable whether they'd have bothered to try and understand random. Random is random. But a creation of an intelligent designer was worth investigating. Well, that was true of scientists maybe in the 16th, 17th century, but you might say, what about in the 21st century? And what about the names of nowadays? Well, again, it turns out there were quite a lot of both ands. I became a Christian, as I said, in my first year in Cambridge. I went to church and I sat next to somebody, my very first Sunday, who had a large beard, and I thought he's probably a professor, and he was. Turns out he was Professor Bob White, and Professor of Geophysics at Cambridge University, and one of the leaders in the church, one of the members of the church council. Then my next door neighbour in college, he was doing geology also. He was lectured by Professor Simon Conway Morris, the paleontologist, who it turned out was also a Christian. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because people say, well, you can't believe in God because of all the dinosaurs, but Professor Conway Morris knows more about dinosaurs than most people on the planet, and yet somehow manages to hold both. Or people say, oh, you can't believe in God because of genetics. But you may know that the same year that Richard Dawkins published his book, The God Delusion, Francis Collins, the director of the Human Genome Project, the project responsible for sequencing human DNA, he published his book, The Language of God, in which he explains his faith in Jesus Christ. So, of course, not every scientist is a Christian, but there are some leading scientists who are both ands. How is that possible? I want to suggest it's because actually there is no conflict at all between modern science and the teaching of Jesus in the Bible. I know of no conflict that exists like that, provided we don't cheat in the way that we set up the question. Of course, it is possible to define science atheistically so that the only kind of explanations that you count as scientific are ones that are explicitly atheistic. But all you've done in that case is just smuggled in the answer in the question. It's not very good science. I'll give you an analogy. Imagine I made a machine to detect visible light. So inside my machine, I've got a prism to split the light up into all its component wavelengths, all the way through from visible red through to visible blue. But I'm not interested in anything other than the visible spectrum, so I don't bother putting any detectors in beyond visible blue or visible red. One of you comes up to me and says, oh, I think I've discovered this thing called infrared light. I think that's how the remote control works on the TV. I say, oh, very interesting. Let me test it with my machine. I point your remote control at my visible light detector, I press the button, and it registers nothing. And I say, well, it's obvious that infrared light doesn't exist. I mean, that would be a stupid conclusion, wouldn't it? If I've set up the experiment only to be sensitive to the visible, I can't use that experiment to conclude anything about something it couldn't measure in the first place. So I think as long as we're objective about science, then I think there's nothing I know of in science that contradicts the Bible. Let me just try and define what science is. It's basically an apparatus of inquiry, a method of finding things out, by which you observe the world, you try and describe what you've observed, and then you set up experiments to test or falsify that hypothesis. There's nothing about that methodology that means you can't use it as a Christian. As I've said, many, many Christian scientists. Nor is there anything discovered using that methodology that contradicts the claims of the Bible. However, very obviously there is a conflict, which is probably why some of you are here. It's a controversial issue. I want to suggest that the real conflict, though, isn't between science and Jesus, but rather with science as a kind of neutral thing in the middle. You can be an atheist or you can be a Christian and be a scientist. The real conflict is between two different philosophies, two different belief systems that people bring to their science. There is a conflict between the worldview of atheism and the worldview of the Bible. I want to suggest that science isn't automatically on the atheist side. Those two do go head to head, and often that's the key to understanding the conflict in the media. So what I'm going to do now is to outline these two belief systems and then do what any responsible scientist should do and ask which one makes most sense of the evidence. So here they are, and there's obviously other belief systems other than these two. I'm not going to have a chance to discuss Islam or pantheism or Hinduism, that kind of thing, just for the sake of time, and please ask me about that later. But I'm going to talk about the claims of Jesus Christ and the view of atheism. So firstly, atheism, or naturalism, is the worldview that says that matter and chance are all that there is. So Carl Sagan, the cosmologist, once said, in a parody of the Bible's claim that God was and is to come, Carl Sagan said, no, the cosmos was and is to come. All that ever has been, all that ever will be, is just the cosmos. Or, in the words of Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, mankind is nothing but a chance collocation of atoms on a minor speck of interstellar dust. Now, it's important there that you notice the words nothing but. As a Christian, I agree with him that we're made of atoms and that the Earth is a relatively small bit of kind of debris on the corner of the Milky Way galaxy. But according to Bertrand Russell, that is all that you are. You are reducible to that random assembly of atoms. Or in my own field of neuroscience, Sir Francis Crick, the Nobel laureate, he said, he puts it in inverted commas, because he's not sure how much the concept of personhood really makes sense. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Now again, as a Christian and a neuroscientist, I do believe that our thoughts are bound up with the cells in your brain and the electrons moving around them. But according to Francis Crick, you are nothing but that, no more than that. You are reducible to the matter that comprises you. There's no God, there's no transcendent purpose, there's just us here by accident. And that view does conflict very starkly with the teaching of the Bible. And what I thought I'd do is, rather than give you Christianity in my words, I thought I'd give you Christianity in the Bible's own words. So just in front of you, you've got a text printed, which is taken from a speech that one of Jesus' followers gave in Athens in the first century. Athens was the intellectual capital of the day. People used to gather there to debate the latest ideas. And we're told that St. Paul got speaking to some Epicurean philosophers. The Epicureans didn't believe that the gods had anything to do with human existence. Basically, life here on earth was random, and there was no survival beyond death. And into that, kind of similar to modern atheist context, this is how Paul presents the Christian message. Let me read it to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Let's just pause there. One of you can see, even from the beginning of this speech, that the Christian claim is the virtual opposite of the atheist claim. If you said to Richard Dawkins, does God exist? He would reply no, or actually he'd say probably not, which is just a slightly more sophisticated way of saying no. But if you said to Dawkins, does Christianity exist as a worldwide phenomenon? He'd say, well, obviously it does. I'm not ignorant about this massive force in our world. Well, Richard Dawkins, please could you explain how Christianity came about? Certainly. Human beings invented it. The universe started with randomness. By chance it came up with a human being. By chance we came up with a God. Started with us, and we invented God. And Paul says in this passage, it's actually exactly the opposite way round. It started with God, and he created a universe, and he made us. He gives us life and breath and everything. Two then very different views of the world. Which one makes most sense? I'm going to compare them in three ways, and then I'm done. Okay, so three comparisons between these two views of the world. Firstly, I'm aware this is a contentious term, design. What about evidence for design in the world? Secondly, which one makes most sense of human life? Thirdly, which one makes most sense of Jesus Christ in history? Firstly, then, design. Now, it's a contentious word because not everyone believes that the world has been designed, but everyone at least agrees the world looks as though it's been designed. As you look around us, the idea that this is an accident intuitively seems unlikely. Sir Fred Hoyle, the astronomer, he once asked what the chances were of life as we know it emerging spontaneously out of the primordial soup. And he compared it to the idea of a whirlwind passing through a junkyard and leaving behind it a fully functioning assembled 747 aircraft. I mean, it's possible, that everything could have just been kind of blown into exactly the right position, but intuitively it just seems rather unlikely. However, the naturalists, such as Richard Dawkins, has a ready explanation. This is a passage from his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which was required reading for me when I went up to university. He says this: design, again in inverted commas because he doesn't believe in it, design is only apparent. We have a mechanism to account for it, natural selection. The blind, unconscious, automatic process, which we now know is the explanation for the existence of and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind, no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is that of the blind watchmaker. And that was the title of his book. So, according to Dawkins, natural selection is a random process, and everything you think was designed actually came about simply by this process, purposelessly. Now, often natural selection or evolution is the atheist's kind of one-word response to the Christian on the issue of design. And I want to argue today that it's not good enough as an answer. I'm actually not going to talk about evolution at all, even if you grant that natural selection is all you need to explain a human being, beginning with a single-celled ancestor billions of years ago. And I want to say, I think even that extends far beyond anything that's been shown in the laboratory, and there's all kinds of questions about that. But even if you grant that, you're prepared to accept natural selection as a totalising explanation, you've still got a lot to explain. Because to have natural selection at all, you've first got to have information-carrying, self-replicating molecules, such as RNA or DNA, actually amongst the most complex molecules known to modern chemistry. And how these spontaneously arisen, no one really has any explanation to offer, let alone how they came to contain the information necessary to encode even the proteins of the most simple living cell. But actually the problems get even worse than that, because not only do you need to have RNA, you've also got to have a universe for the RNA to exist in. And as we ask the physicists, they tell us that various aspects of our universe seem extraordinarily finely tuned to make life possible. So let me read you some numbers. These are not special Christian numbers, by the way, that I've got from a dodgy Christian laboratory. There's a mainstream physics numbers. But for example, if the resonance between nuclear ground state energy levels of helium and beryllium was out by 1%, there wouldn't be enough carbon in the universe to sustain life. Not life on this planet, life anywhere in the universe. You've got a 1 in 100 chance of the right ratio of carbon. Okay, 1 in 100, it could have got lucky, right? But it gets worse. If the ratio of the nuclear strong force to the electromagnetic force differed by 1 part in 10 to the 16, no stars could have formed anywhere. 1 in 10 with 16 noughts. Quite unlikely now. Gets worse. If the ratio of the electromagnetic force constant to the gravitational force constant were increased or decreased by 1 part in 10 to the 40, we'd have a universe containing either only big stars, too hot to sustain life, or only small stars, too cold to manufacture chemical elements. And then my favourite one, if the ratio of the expansion and contraction forces acting just after the Big Bang had altered by as little as 1 part in 10 to the 55, the universe would have either expanded too quickly, so all you'd have was hydrogen atoms with millions of miles in between each atom, or it would have expanded too slowly, and gravity would have overcome it, and you get a Big Bang and then a big crunch, a universe, then no universe again, even before you got to 1 nanosecond on your stopwatch. To have any kind of universe that lasts for longer than a nanosecond with stuff bigger than hydrogen, you've got to be accurate within 1 part in 10 to the 55. If these numbers don't mean much to you, here's an analogy. Take a continent the size of America, cover it with 5-penny pieces, stack them to a depth of the distance between here and the moon, 380,000 kilometres away. Do the same for 1 billion other continents the same size. Paint one of them red with nail varnish, blindfold your girlfriend or boyfriend, get him to pick one at random, and if he gets the red one, that's about 1 in 10 to the 40, which is about 1 million times more likely than getting the right expansion rate at the Big Bang. In other words, it's starting to look quite implausible that this came about by accident. Very, very unlikely. and to my mind, quite easy to explain if there's a God who made the world and everything in it and set up the numbers the way that he wanted them to be. Well, as I say, these are mainstream numbers and the atheists know about them. And increasingly recently, the response has been to appeal to the concept of a multiverse. You may have heard of this. So the idea is if you've got infinitely many universes, then one of them will get lucky. It doesn't matter how improbable. If you do the experiment infinitely many times, your number will come up. But the interesting thing about that is, of course, that the multiverse isn't an observable theory or a repeatable or a testable theory, as the review in the scientific journal Nature said of the theory. It can't properly be called a scientific theory. You can't test it or see it or check it. You can believe it, if you want, by faith as a philosophical position, but really without any evidence. And I just want to challenge you, if you appeal to the multiverse, that's what you're doing. It's really a religious position to explain the very, very unlikely numbers that science throws you. And I want to suggest, actually, a multiverse is not necessarily a better explanation than a creative, intelligent God. In fact, I think in various ways it's a rather worse explanation. If everything has happened somewhere in the multiverse, then as well as the version of me that finishes this talk, there's the version of me that stops dead now. No, we're not in that universe, sorry, if you're hoping that I'll shut up. As well as the universe in which you won at Monopoly yesterday with a hotel on Park Lane. There's the universe in which your housemate won with a hotel on Mayfair, and every other possible permutation of that game, and of everything that's happened to you and also didn't happen to you, somewhere in the infinitely many copies of yourself that are simultaneously existing in the multiverse. Now, to me, this creates rather a lot of problems. Most things stop beginning to mean anything, and it requires rather too much faith. Multiverse design, which one makes most sense? Could it be that there's a God who made the world, who chose the numbers, and that's why modern science observes them to be so carefully tuned? Secondly, more briefly, which one makes most sense of human life? Now, please don't understand me. My argument is not Christianity is nicer, so it must be true. Nice things aren't always true. But here's the argument. I'm worried about a philosophy that none of the people who say they believe in it are able to live out. One of my big problems with Christians used to be that they were hypocrites. You know, all the stories in the newspaper about paedophile priests or vicars embezzling money. And I thought, look, there you go. They don't live out what they believe. And if you've got a problem with religious hypocrisy, you're in good company, because Jesus hated it. He couldn't stand the two-faced religious person. He hated that. But what I never noticed as an atheist was that I was guilty of hypocrisy. I was espousing a philosophy that I couldn't live by. John Gray, the professor of European thought at the LSE in London, he has a go at atheists in his book Straw Dogs for failing to take their argument through to their logical conclusion. He says that we need to realise that we live in a world that is indifferent to our hopes as it is to our sufferings and our crimes. The world is random, then randomness doesn't care about your life or about what you do. It's just randomness. What should an atheist say to a mother who's just lost her son in a hit-and-run driving accident, as happened to my mum's friend? Unlucky. Just the way in which the atoms of the universe bumped into one another meaninglessly, billions of years after the universe began by chance. We'll be talking more about that question of suffering on Wednesday night. I hope you can come back. I remember having a discussion with one of the professors during my PhD. He was kind of teasing me for being a Christian. And I said, well, look, Kate, tell me, if you're right about the universe, why would killing you be wrong? This is for the sake of argument, okay, we were good friends. Why would it be any different to cutting a grapefruit in half for my breakfast? All I'd be doing in both cases was rearranging the atoms of the universe in a slightly different way. Kate atoms, grapefruit atoms, much the same kind of thing. And when she thought about it, she said after a minute, well, my mother would be upset. That's the difference. But we were neuroscientists, so I said to her, Kate, what's upset? Upset is just the change in the concentration of a neurochemical in the randomly assembled collection of atoms, which is your mother's brain. Why does that matter? Well, of course, someone will come back and say, well, we've evolved to care about these things for the preservation of our own DNA. But the trouble is this idea that we care is reducible to something that doesn't. Sociology is just the product of a load of brains together in a room, really, isn't it? So sociology is reducible to neuroscience. Please, can we have the sociology department's budget? Thanks very much. But neuroscience is really reducible to chemistry, because all brains are is a collection of chemicals, and chemistry is reducible to physics. And so let's put all of our funding into the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, which I think is what we actually do. It's very expensive. But ultimately, what we think cares is actually just a description that we've given to randomness. It doesn't care. But if the Bible's right, there is a God who made us, who cares. That God is personal, and so we're personal. That God is moral, and we are moral. Paul writes in verse 26, look down. I think this is extraordinary, this claim. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, in order that they should, here's the mind-blowing thing, in order that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way towards him and find him, though he's actually not far from each one of us. I don't know about you, but that was an utterly extraordinary thought for me. I was looking into God as maybe just the first cause of the universe, the person who made the Big Bang go bang. But the Christian conception of God is that he's a person who not only made you, but wants to know you personally. Your personality, your life matters because it is a gift from a personal God. That was an extraordinary thought. And this brings us on to our final comparison. The thing about getting to know people is that science is kind of limited. Now, science, don't get me wrong, it's a very powerful tool. You can discover many useful things about the world, but you can't find out much about a person using science. Let's imagine, here I am. I'm not going to say anything. You can do whatever experiments you want. Okay, you can't, but let's imagine you can. So you could do scanning electron microscopy on the fibres of my shirt. Tell me how many dust mites there are per square inch or something like that. You could take a blood sample, do some DNA fingerprinting. You can tell me if I'm wanted by Interpol. I'm not, by the way. Or whether I'm likely to die prematurely of any known genetic disease. You could do gas chromatography under my armpits. You could work out what deodorant I'm wearing and whether it's coping with this slightly stressful situation in which I find myself. But that is about all you could tell. You couldn't tell my name. You couldn't tell really anything that's important about knowing me as a person. What I love, what I would die for, what makes me laugh, what makes me cry. Which is why I very much doubt any of you here who is in a relationship on your first date said, please can I take a small scratch from the inside of your cheek? I'll be running some tests and I'll be back with a decision in a few weeks. It's just not how it works, is it? We just don't do... Because science is powerful, but it can't tell you everything that is important about the world. And if that's true, even just about getting to know another human being, how do you go about finding out about the God who made us, who you can't even isolate from the apparatus to take a null reading? Excuse me, God, please can you leave the universe so we can compare the results and see if you make a difference? I mean, you just can't do that kind of experiment. How are you going to know him? And the Bible says, well, we wouldn't be able to, except that God took the initiative to make himself known to us. Just look at the very end of that paragraph. Verse 30, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, that is, to change their minds about him. Because he's fixed a day on which he'll judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he's appointed, and of this he's given proof to all by raising him from the dead. Again, what a surprise it was for me as an atheist to read in the Bible about evidence. I'd always believed the Richard Dawkins line that science is about facts and religion is about floaty kind of leaps in the dark faith. And here I am reading the Bible saying that God has given us reasons for changing our minds, evidence to change our minds, namely the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And if you look up the resurrection of Jesus in the God delusion, you'll find that Dawkins says it can't have happened being by its nature a violation of the laws of science. Now, I don't think that's good science. To decide the outcome before you look at the data because you won't budge on your theory. If you know anything about the history of science, you know that science often makes leaps forward when people are prepared to question their theory in the face of the evidence. If your theory is atheism, of course you can't have a resurrection. There couldn't be a resurrection in an atheistic world. But what if your theory is wrong? What if actually this is a world that God made and that he gives you life and breath and everything? What if your life isn't meaningless but is created by a personal God that wants to know you? And what if, to get our attention in history, he sent his son to die and then beat death on the third day? We'll be looking much more at these questions all the way through this week and looking at some of the evidence for them. I'd love you to come with an objective, open mind. Thank you so much for listening.